I wasn't quite sure what to cover today because there's a lot of animals that I work with. So I work with all of our ungulate species, so all of our big game hoofed animals, of which there's a lot around here, as you guys know. So I wasn't quite sure what to cover, so I'm just going to kind of touch on some different things, touch on some current research we're doing with a couple different species. But yeah, as I go through, I feel like I'm just going to kind of scratch the surface. So if there's anything you guys want to ask, feel free to shout it out, raise your hand, stop me in the middle. It's no big deal. Okay, we'll do it that way. So I was just going to start with the Jackson elk herd to start us out. So for maybe some new folks in the room, the Jackson elk herd is one of the largest elk herds in North America. At one point it was the largest. I'm not sure if it's still the largest, but it's one of the largest. And it's very complex. It moves, the elk in this herd move across a number of different jurisdictions, including Yellowstone National Park, here, Grand Teton National Park, Bridger Teton National Forest, in and out of wilderness areas, and then a lot of them come down to the National Elk Refuge to winter here just outside of Jackson, and then a lot of the elk also spend time on private lands around here. So a pretty complex herd with a lot of animals doing different things. And so what I just wanted to start with was kind of describe the way we break it out management-wise, as we manage this entire herd of a lot of animals, but we kind of break it down into these 4 different herd segments. And so the first one is the Yellowstone Teton Wilderness herd segment. And these elk spend the summer kind of in this general area up in southern Yellowstone National Park and the Teton Wilderness on the Bridger Teton National Forest. Then we also have a large number of elk that spend the summer in central Grand Teton National Park. So these are probably a lot of the elk that are seen on summer tours. And then another large segment that spends the summer in the Gros Ventre drainage to the east of Jackson here. And then we have a herd segment which has actually been growing quite rapidly in recent years, which spends the summer to the south of Grand Teton National Park, mostly on private lands, kind of in the Spring Gulch, West Bank, Wilson area. And so those are kind of the summer segments. And then migration-wise, so these Yellowstone Teton Wilderness elk, we refer to them as our long-distance migrants. So they're migrating from their summer ranges way up north all the way down into the valley for the winter time. The majority of these elk come to the National Elk Refuge for the winter. Some of them also stop a little short and spend the winter in the Buffalo Valley as well. Then the central Grand Teton elk do the same. They kind of come down into the valley. The majority of them spend the winter as well on the National Elk Refuge, as do the southern segment elk. We kind of call these the short distance or resident elk. They do have a distinct summer range and a distinct winter range, but they only migrate a couple miles between the National Elk Refuge and their summer ranges over on private lands kind of along the Snake River. And then we have the Gros Ventre segment, and these elk do a couple different things. Some of them come down into the Gros Ventre River drainage to spend the winter, and then some of them also come all the way out onto the National Elk Refuge to spend the winter too. So as you guys can kind of see, there's kind of this, there's these kind of broad summer ranges, and then all of these elk are kind of funneling down into these very limited small winter ranges around the valley here. So complexity-wise, again, a lot of elk doing different things. We also have different segments of the herd that are performing at different levels. And so the long-distance migrant elk that are going up to Yellowstone and the Teton Wilderness, they have fairly low calf recruitment every year, so low productivity. In the summertime, they have about 20 calves per 100 cows. That's called a calf ratio. That's one of the metrics that we use to measure how herds are performing. Compared to these elk that are resident elk kind of down here along the Snake River on private lands, they're averaging about 50 calves per 100 cows in the summertime, so about double the reproduction. And so that leads to, I'm not going to go into it, but a lot of different kind of management strategies that we have as far as hunting and different management of these different segments of the herd that are kind of performing at different levels. The main reason for this difference is these elk down here are fairly shielded from predation, and they have really good food throughout the summer, spring, summer, and fall. So they're spending, time on irrigated hay fields, in landscaping, in kind of nice lush areas on private land. These elk up here are exposed to much higher levels of predation, and then also exposed to higher levels of drought in the summertime as well. So this map just kind of shows again those different areas in a bit more detail, but a bit messy. So this is a lot of our collar data that we've collected on these different segments of the elk herd over the years. So you can see, here's the Gros-Ventre elk, here's kind of the Teton Wilderness, Yellowstone elk, and then these elk kind of in Grand Teton National Park, and then down closer to town in the National Elk Refuge. So we know a lot about these elk, fortunately, through a lot of collaring efforts. A lot of funding has been put into this because this herd is so big, it's so complicated, it's so complex, and it's really dynamic. So one of the things that we do every year to monitor and survey the herd is an annual helicopter survey. So this shows, these purple lines are where we flew our helicopter survey for all species this past February. So this gives us kind of a snapshot in time where we survey elk, moose, bighorn sheep, bison from the air to try to get trend counts on how these herds are doing. So starting with Jackson elk, I'm going to show you guys a lot of graphs that look like this, so sorry if you don't like graphs because there's going to be a lot, but this is really kind of the nuts and bolts of what we do for management-wise as far as monitoring these herds. So for each of the herds, Jackson elk included, we have what's called a population objective. So we as a department have a number that we would like that herd to be at. We manage it for kind of plus or minus 20% of that number, since we know we're never going to have exactly 11,000 animals. And so for the Jackson elk herd, that population objective is this dashed line, which is 11,000 elk. So we're basically trying to manage this big, complicated herd to be a total of 11,000 elk, again, plus or minus 20%. And so you can see, like back in the 1990s, this herd was much higher. We were trend counting, this year we trend counted 16,000 elk in the herd, so much higher than that 11,000 number. And then through hunting seasons and kind of structured management, we brought that herd down to that 11,000 number. It's kind of hovered right around that 11,000 number for quite a while now. This year, in February, we counted a total of 11,057 elk in the herd, so pretty much right on target. And these are elk that are both on supplemental feed, on feed grounds, on the National Elk Refuge, and elk that are wintering out on what we call native winter range that we count with the helicopter. This is a look at that, like I mentioned before, the calf ratio for the herd. So again, this is something that we pay pretty close attention to. So this is the number of calves per 100 cows in the winter time in February when we do our surveys. And you can see that in recent years it's been very stable. Herd-wide, it's been a rate about 20 calves per 100 cows in the winter time. And this year it was 21. So again, that's kind of a mix, like I talked about before. That includes elk that are coming from, the private lands that have higher numbers of calves, and the elk that are coming from Yellowstone that have lower numbers. So this is kind of a mix and an average of the entire herd altogether. But that calf ratio, basically equates to, you can see that the numbers of elk have been very stable over time, and again, that calf ratio has been very stable over time as well. This is a map showing all the places that we saw elk during our annual winter trend count last February. So the dots correspond to the group size of the animals. And so you can see like these 4 large dots here, just outside of Jackson, are on the National Elk Refuge. So those are the 4 main feeding areas that the National Elk Refuge feeds elk. So those are big groups of elk. This one up here is also a big group. This is on our state-run feed ground up in the Gros-Ventre called the Patrol Cabin Feed Ground. And then you can see there's also kind of these scattered, smaller groups of elk out on native winter range, and then some larger groups as well out on native winter range. But that kind of gives you an idea, at least in the winter time, of where the majority of elk wintered, at least this winter. The other thing that we manage for is, we have that goal of 11,000 elk in the entire herd. But as you guys can imagine, we don't want all 11,000 elk standing, in the same spot in the wintertime. We want them to be spread out across the landscape. And so we have these other kind of winter distribution goals within that 11,000. So we have a goal, kind of 3 different areas where we'd like elk to be in the wintertime. The first area is the Elk Refuge, where we have a goal of 5,000 elk. The Gros-Ventre drainage, our goal is 3,500 elk, and then other winter ranges, a goal of 2,500 elk. So that includes areas like the Buffalo Valley. It also includes these areas. It's kind of hard to see, but all these little dots are to the east of the National Elk Refuge on native winter range, kind of around Curtis Canyon and Flat Creek, as well as some other areas. So one of the things that we've been struggling with in recent years that you guys may have heard about is we've consistently had higher numbers of elk on the Elk Refuge than we would like. So again, our goal is 5,000. This year we had 7,500. We've had as high as like 9,000 elk in recent years on the Elk Refuge. In the Gros-Ventre, we've been consistently down. So we're about 1,000 elk below our goal this past winter. And then on other winter ranges, we're also down. So again, we're kind of at the target numbers-wise with 11,000, but the distribution of where those elk are spending the winter is not where we want it to be. And that's kind of reflected in this figure as well. So each of these lines corresponds to those 3 different winter ranges that I just talked about. So this top line is the National Elk Refuge, the black one. The middle line is the Gros-Ventre, and then the bottom line is the other winter ranges. And so you can see that in recent years, the number of elk wintering on the Elk Refuge, the proportion of the herd, not just the number, but the proportion of the herd has been consistently growing. So more and more of the herd is coming to the Elk Refuge. And then the segment in the Gros-Ventre has been declining, and then these other winter ranges has been kind of flat. Let's see what's next. Yeah, so this winter it's actually 2017-2018 winter, you can see that we had almost no elk in the Gros-Ventre, and then this huge spike of elk on the Elk Refuge. And so that was a winter where things were really out of whack. And things have kind of started to come back a little bit, but in general, yeah, we don't really want to see this trend of more and more elk on the Elk Refuge. So this is just kind of an interesting side note. Again, in 2017-2018, we had almost no elk wintering in the Gros-Ventre. And so this graph is showing over time the number of elk just in that Gros-Ventre herd segment. And you can see that it has been consistently declining over the years. We kind of bottomed out in winter 2017-2018 when we had a total of 86 elk in the Gros-Ventre, 11 elk on our feed ground total. which caused quite a stir. People were really worried about what is going on with this segment of the herd. Are there no elk left in the Gros-Ventre? You know, what is happening? And since then, you can see that luckily those numbers have started to come up a little bit. But there was a lot of concern about, you know, is this segment of the herd just dying out? Are there no more elk left? Or are they just moving to other areas? So some of the work that we've been doing, and we're going to continue with some of the funding that Taylor's just gotten from Wildlife Tourism for Tomorrow, which is awesome, is we've been focusing on collaring elk from this Gros-Ventre herd segment and trying to understand more about what's going on. And so for the past 4 years, we've been collaring elk. We had to stop for 2020 with COVID, but we've had 3 different capture efforts of these elk over the past 4 years. We've put out a total of 59 collars on these elk, all female cow elk. And a couple things that we've learned is basically the survival rates of these elk is very high, so no issue with survival of elk. And then the other interesting thing that we've learned is that basically this huge reduction in numbers in the Gros-Ventre that we saw in that one winter was basically just due to elk moving to other areas. Let's see. So this is an animation of some of these collared elk. I'll play this a couple times, but here's the Gros-Ventre, kind of the Gros-Ventre drainage. Here's the National Elk Refuge in Jackson down here. And I don't know if you guys can see, there's like a date on the top of it. But basically what's happening is, so right here is kind of winter time, so you can kind of see the elk settle into some wintering areas. They kind of don't move too much. And then come spring, they start moving a lot more. Summer, all of them go back up into the Gros-Ventre area. So they're kind of on their summer ranges now, spread out. And then in the fall, they'll start coming back down into the Gros-Ventre drainage right here. And then in the winter, the really important thing that we learned from this work, I don't know if I can pause it, as you can see is in the winter time, some of them stay in the Gros-Ventre here, but then a lot of them come down to the National Elk Refuge as well. And so what was happening was, these elk weren't dead, but basically they were getting counted. They weren't getting counted in the Gros-Ventre, they were getting counted on the National Elk Refuge. So that what we've learned is that you know, elk, at least in this portion of the herd, are really fluid in where they spend the winter, so they can shift winter ranges from year to year. Sometimes they stay in the Gros-Ventre, sometimes they go to the Elk Refuge. We've had some go to Dubois, we've had some go to the Upper Green, but they always go back to the same areas for the summer and the fall.
I got a quick question. Can you, we tend to see a lot of collared elk out in the field. Can you go over what colors are what locations?
Yes, Ben might be able to help you too, but so there's a lot of different types of collars out there, so it's a little confusing, but if you guys see, a lot of them have these colored vinyl neck bands on. So if you see white neck bands, those are elk that have been collared on the National Elk Refuge. So they've been on the National Elk Refuge in the winter. If they have a red neck band, Ben has collared them on our feed grounds in the Gros-Ventre. And then what other colors are there, Ben? Is there gray?
Gray is South Park, green is Dog Creek, yellow is Camp Horse. You'll see some blue. Those come out of Del Creek and up into the upper Gros-Ventre, and then green in the upper Gros-Ventre, probably coming out of the upper green feed grounds or feed ground. They're all color coded.
And then you might see some that just don't have a color. They don't have a colored collar on. They just have like the actual radio collar, and those are probably these Gros-Ventre elk that were collared off of the feed grounds just on native winter range in the fall. So there's a lot of different, there's a lot of different types of collars. I might move on just because I don't want to take too much time. Real quick on bison, this is my only slide on bison, but the Jackson bison herd here that lives in Grand Teton Refuge. This is a look again at the trend counts of the bison over the years. So we used to have close to 1,000 bison in the Jackson bison herd. That was too many bison. Our objective is to have 500 right here, plus or minus 20%. And so through hunting, we've brought that population down closer to that, well, actually slightly below that 500 number now. This year we counted a total of 466 bison, so we're just below that 500 number. So kind of right where we want to be at with the bison numbers wise. Okay, moose, Jackson moose. This is a look at where we saw moose during our February 2022 survey. So I know that there's a lot of moose obviously visible right around town, in residential areas right off the road, which is awesome for viewing. But we do also have quite a few moose that are farther up the Grosmont drainage, and then a lot of moose wintering in the Buffalo Valley area as well, Spread Creek, Elk Ranch area. So this is a look at Jackson moose herd numbers over the years. So I'm sure most of you kind of know the story of our Jackson moose herd here, like a lot of moose herds around the West, unfortunately, around the world, unfortunately. We used to trend count over 1,000 moose in this herd. So this is just numbers of moose that we see from the helicopter. We know we don't see all of them because it's really difficult actually to see moose from the helicopter. A lot of times they're in trees and really difficult to see. So back in the 80s, the biologist at that time was trend counting about over 1,000 moose. We fly those same areas now, and basically we're counting between 250 and 350 moose in recent years. So about a 70% reduction in our moose herd since the 80s. And that's due to a whole variety of factors. We can go into that if you guys have questions, but basically it boils down to climate change, habitat loss through pretty intense wildfires in a lot of these areas, predation by both wolves and grizzly bears, as well as some new diseases and parasites that are coming on the scene that I think Ben will touch on, as well as vehicle collision mortality. So unfortunately, a lot of things affecting our moose. And with climate change and warming temperatures, moose just are not a species that are very well adapted to that at all. So yeah, things are looking not so great for moose here, unfortunately. So we've kind of been stuck. I mean, we've kind of bottomed out and just been stable at these lower numbers for quite a few years now. One promising trend that we've seen in recent years, this is the calf ratio. So we saw this decline in the calf ratio, kind of bottomed out in 2008. And then since 2008, it's been climbing back up again. And so that's a promising sign that, moose are having more calves that are surviving, at least till February when we count them. So that's a promising trend that, maybe these numbers are going to start to come back in the future.
Aly, with moose, to see the population grow, what cow-calf ratio would you guys like to see?
Yeah, like in the 50s is great, which is where we're at right now. So I think this year was like 55 or something. So yeah, these numbers up here definitely indicate the potential for a growing population, which is awesome. And moose, as you guys know, are different than a lot of our other ungulates in that they can produce twins. So they can, under the right conditions, if they have really good nutrition, the population can grow very fast if they can produce twins and have twins survive.
So you mentioned all those challenges earlier that moose are facing, and maybe the cause of the decline. Like, what's up with this growth? And why do you think cow-calf ratios are on the upward trend?
Yeah, this is probably my guess is that this is probably due. Well, let's see. Probably a lot of this decline and a lot of this decline was probably driven by habitat changes, so kind of loss of habitat, poor habitat. And so this probably shows like the habitat is kind of rebounding and coming back. So, cow moose are in better nutritional condition. They can, produce a calf every year. Maybe they can produce twins every year. So yeah, I think that means that moose are in better nutritional condition so that they can have more babies and have those babies survive. The caveat, which Ben might touch on again, is so these moose are counted in February. That's by no means the end of the winter, and we do see a lot of calf mortality between February and now, basically. One of the things that we're seeing more and more in recent years, as you guys might have seen, is winter ticks on moose. And we know that this year we picked up a number of dead moose calves that most likely died of winter ticks. So there can be, even though this looks really good in February, there could be some additional mortality, that we're not measuring. Yeah.
I'm noticing on these graphs a lot, right around 2008, 2009, this seems to be where that decline and then an increase is happening. Being that I'm new to the area, what was going on around 2008, 2009? Was it a drought season? Was it fire? Why does it seem like those 2 years seem to be the turning point?
Good question. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I don't know if Ben heard that. I don't know. I know that, so we did go through a significant drought kind of in the early 2000s. So that's probably a lot of it. As far as moose go, the 1988 Yellowstone fires had a significant impact on moose habitat up in the Teton Wilderness. So maybe, enough time has gone by that some of that habitat is starting to come back. Ben, did you hear that question?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know what would cause it kind of to start to bounce back after kind of bottoming out. It could be that moose were starting to kind of redistribute themselves around the landscape and become less susceptible to predation. It could be they figured out better ways to cope with some of the temperature concerns or parasite concerns that we have. Like Aly said, it might have been, we've done a bunch of work with habitat and kind of monitoring habitat to see kind of when that turnover occurs. So a burn comes through, it's very productive for a couple of years, but doesn't have any of that thermal cover. And we're kind of reaching that point where in areas that did burn incredibly hot, the kind of overstory stature is getting to the point now where it's providing some thermal cover, which for moose I think is more important than the nutrition because they're so heat intolerant. So we may be actually reaching that point where some of these quote unquote boreal forests that had burned in the late 80s maybe starting to reach that point where they're actually providing enough thermal cover that moose can kind of utilize that again. It'd be really interesting to see because 88 fires came through and then about 6 years later, wolves were reintroduced. So there was kind of this thought that maybe the fires weren't really playing a big role. It was all predator driven. We just had a major wildfire go through kind of the snowy range in southeast Wyoming. So very high moose density locations, pretty high demand for moose licenses down there. They produce a lot of moose in that area, but they didn't have this large scale wildfire. And so they had pre-fire animals marked and we're looking at their movements. The Mullen fire came through, burned almost the entirety of their moose habitat. And then we went and put more collars out on moose that were remaining to see what they did. Because that's kind of what we've been missing in the 88 fires. We didn't have anything really marked pre-fire to show if those moose moved out of there or if they found kind of small pockets of habitat to utilize. So that'll be really interesting to watch that over the next 5 to 10 years to see how those moose cope with such a major change in habitat and kind of what they're keying in on or what their survival rate does. Does their overall survival rate drop because of that loss of that kind of canopy cover, overstory cover, and then the subsequent thermal impacts on those animals, or are we completely off base and they're driven entirely by nutrition and they'll find a way. So, yeah, kind of long story short, we don't know why they did that. Moose are really good at pioneering. So if you dump a bunch of moose in a place, they'll do really, really good for a while, but they seem to kind of outcompete their habitat, and then they kind of drop back down. We're starting to see that in other parts of the state now. North Park, Colorado is one of the anomalies to that. They've had high moose densities for a long time. They also, yeah, kind of long story short, we don't know why they did that. Moose are really good at pioneering. So if you dump a bunch of moose in a place, they'll do really, really good for a while, but they seem to kind of outcompete their habitat, and then they kind of drop back down. We're starting to see that in other parts of the state now. North Park, Colorado is one of the anomalies to that. They've had high moose densities for a long time. They also harvest at a very high rate. So yeah, a lot of things going into this kind of moose conundrum that we're trying to kind of pick and pull at and see if we can figure out what's really driving these populations.
Just to reiterate what Dan and Aly are both saying, what's different about moose, usually when we're talking about thermal cover, we're talking about animals staying warm in the winter. This is a situation that's the opposite for moose, where they need to have cold temperatures to stay cool. And so they're just overheating, both summer and winter, I guess, is the difference between moose and other big game.
Yeah, I think like especially this winter, it was pretty mild for most of the winter, and we and everyone were like, oh, this is a good winter. There's a lot of animals are going to make it. They're having an easy time. But for moose, it's like completely opposite. They do not have a good winter. We're seeing quite a bit of winter kill on moose right now, so they did not have a